Let's pick up where we left off last time, which was with the infamous Milgram experiment, which I used to illustrate a particular position in social psychology, which many of us call the doctrine of situationism. The idea that the individual's thoughts, behaviors, feelings, whatever, are determined by the situation that that person is in. This is generally known as the psychology of social influence. And you'll notice that when Milgram tried to explain his experimental findings and to relate them to things in the outside world, he talked about situational control of obedient behavior. And when he talked about the factors that strengthen obedient behavior, that make obedient behavior more likely, he defined these aspects of the situation in purely objective terms. Whether an authority figure is present or not, how close, physically close, the subject is to the victim, how physically close the authority figure is to the subject, and the status of the institution in which the behavior is taking place. All of these are objective features of the situation. And I tried to point out early on that never mind the real world, but in any experiment like this, you really can't understand the behavior of the subject unless you see the situation from the subject's point of view. And I tried to point out that from the subject's point of view, the Milgram experiment contains a whole plethora of cues that would lead subjects to think that things are not as they seem, that something else is going on in the experiment. In particular, the behavior of the experimenter would lead subjects to think that they themselves were the object of the experiment, not the effect of punishment on learning. Now, just in passing, I'll say that there's a whole social psychological analysis, cognitive analysis of the experimental situation that Orrin was quite famous for. He's now deceased. But the most important aspect of it is that Orrin reminded us that subjects in psychological experiments are sentient beings. They're intelligent people who are aware of what's going on and are trying to figure things out. You can't, in psychology, treat a subject as if it's kind of a beaker of chemicals, which you can heat or chill or throw another beaker of chemicals together with it and just kind of see what explodes. Subjects in psychological experiments are trying to figure things out. And the generalizable point to the real world is that's what people are always trying to do. They're always trying to figure out what's going on, and their behavior is determined by the answer that they come up with to the problem of figuring out what's going on. Let me just illustrate what looks like the same kind of point, but with a very, very, very important shift in perspective. Here's another famous experiment in social psychology. I think anybody here who's taken Psych 1 has read about this experiment. Famous Darley and Latney experiment in which subjects were working in a room, completing some personality questionnaires. They were either working alone or they were working in groups. And then the experimenter stages an emergency in the laboratory. And the finding of the Darley and Latney bystander intervention experiment is that subjects who were alone were much more likely to render assistance in the emergency than subjects who were not alone, who were working away in the presence of even a small group of other subjects. Now, from the point of view of simply social psychological situationism, the conclusion is being with others, which is an objective fact about the situation, impairs helping behavior. Okay, that's the finding, right? These subjects are objectively alone and they help. These subjects are objectively part of a group and they don't help. Okay, but that's not the conclusion that Darley and Latney drew. Not least because there's lots of other experiments that shows that there are positive social influences of group membership on helping. What Darley and Latney did, and what Milgram failed to do, was to take the next step to analyze this situation from the subject's point of view, to analyze how the subjects perceive the situation. And what they identified was a number of different deterrents to helping, all of which are expressed in terms of the subject's mental state. So, for example, maybe subjects are afraid to help because they think they're going to get hurt too. Okay, or it's possible that they just don't believe they lack the skills to help. If somebody here has a heart attack right here, right now, who knows what to do? Not too many. Some people, not too many, right? So the people who think they have the skill might help, but others who don't think they have the skill might say, oh, I'm going to do more harm than good, or whatever. You're looking at the situation from the subject's point of view. Diffusion of responsibility. I don't have to help, somebody else will help. Okay? Or best of all, Darley and Latney's concept of pluralistic ignorance. Their idea is that situations are inherently ambiguous, a point I made in the first day of class, and before we try to take action in any kind of situation, we usually wait for the situation to be clarified. And one of the ways in which we clarify the situation is by looking to others for cues. Okay, so you're sitting in a group of people filling out personality questionnaires, and there's a thud in the next room, and somebody says, well, I could use a little help in here, right? So you don't know exactly what that means, so what do? You'll look at the other people in the group. The other people in the group, they don't know exactly what that means either, so what do? They're looking at you. You're looking at them, they're not doing anything. They're looking at you, you're not doing anything either. Your behavior helps define the situation as a non-emergency, okay? You're trying to figure out what's going on. So if you analyze the situation from the subject's point of view, you get a whole different perspective on these kinds of outcomes. The point is that cognition mediates between the individual and the environment, okay? The situation doesn't simply act on the individual, eliciting various kinds of thoughts or behaviors or feelings or whatever. Rather, what happens always and everywhere is that, as Orrin argued, the individual is striving to give meaning to his experience, give meaning to his situation, and his response in that situation is going to be determined by the meaning that he or she gives to that situation. Now, how do you get that meaning? Well, you draw on all your knowledge, things you've acquired through learning, reasoning, common sense, and all that kind of business. But the point is, the situation doesn't control behavior independently of the person. The effects of the situation are mediated through the person, and they're especially mediated through the person's cognitive processes. Now, it turns out, as a matter of historical fact, that Kurt Lewin understood this perfectly well. He said, yeah, behavior is a function of personal factors and environmental factors, but he was very clear, in a way that traditional personality psychologists and traditional social psychologists were not, that the person and the environment are not independent causal elements. Rather, Lewin made it very clear that the personal determinants of behavior and the environmental determinants of behavior were interdependent variables. They interacted with each other, to use a little bit more modern language. Okay, behavior is a function of the person and the environment, but person and the environment are interdependent variables. This general idea that the person and the environment can't be separated lies at the heart of what's now known as the doctrine of interactionism in psychology, which was first announced by the late Ken Bowers, a American, actually, a psychologist who worked in Canada for his career. Says down here, interactionists agree that a person's behavior is determined by the situation in which it occurs, but they also assert that the situation itself is largely determined by the person. Okay, put another way, okay, the doctrine of interactionism situationism basically says that situations are as much a function of the person's behavior, broadly construed, as the person's behavior is a function of the situation. So what we've got from the point of view of interactionism is a situation like this. Yeah, you've got personal determinants of behavior, and yeah, you've got environmental determinants of behavior, but you've got the person affecting the environment, which in turn affects behavior. The doctrine of interactionism simply tries to spell out the various ways in which people affect the environments to which they respond. And there are basically 4 ways in which people do this. First, through evocation. Simply by being in a situation, we change that situation, okay? And this is especially vividly illustrated in cases of in-group, out-group, or minority-majority group status. Put a minority group member in a group of majority group people, changes the situation, okay? Put a majority group member in a group of minority group people, changes the situation. Hasn't done anything, he's just there, but the situation is changed simply by virtue of the presence of the individual. The idea here is that the simple presence or appearance of the person evokes a response from the environment, evokes a response from other people in the environment that changes that environment. The classic example of this is gender role, gender differences in behavior. The moment you pop out of the womb, somebody says, hey, you're a little boy or a little girl, and that assignment of sex changes the environment. The infant's gender changes the environment in which that infant is going to be made. In one case, it's an environment all of pinks and ribbons and lace. In the other case, it's all an environment of blue and football and broken teeth and all of that kind of stuff. Just to make the point in extreme, the idea is here that the infant hasn't done anything, hasn't had a chance to do anything. But yet, the simple noticing of some external, the physical feature of the child determines the environment in which that child is going to be raised. Selection is another way in which the person affects the environment by putting him or herself in one environment as opposed to another. Every time we choose to go in one direction as opposed to another direction, we change the environment in which our behavior takes place. You decide to go to Berkeley as opposed to Stanford. You decide to join a fraternity or sorority as opposed to not. You decide to join a particular club as opposed to something else. Okay, you change the environment for yourself. Behavioral manipulation, another way in which people change environments. You go to a party and it's kind of dull, so you do something to liven it up. You put a lampshade on your head. You start dancing on the tablecloth. You do whatever it is you do. You're engaging in some kind of overt behavior that manipulates the environment, changes it from one kind to another. Finally, last but certainly not least, we change environments through covert behavior, what we would prefer to call by thinking, cognitive transformations, by changing the meaning of the environment from one meaning to another, because it's the meaning of the environment that determines how we're going to respond to it, okay? So again, the point here is that from a cognitive point of view, we have to make a distinction between the objective environment, the environment as it would be described in almost physical terms by an objective observer, and the subjective environment, the meaning that the environment has for the individual, the way the individual perceives the environment. People manipulate the objective environment by evocation, by selection, by behavioral manipulation. Okay, you choose to come to Berkeley instead of going to Stanford. Well, that's an objective fact. You're now at Berkeley, right? You're not down there. You're over here. Or you could say, oh, gee, I really wish I could have gone to Stanford, so I'm just kind of stuck here at Berkeley because I couldn't pay my tuition otherwise. Well, that's a very different meaning of being at Berkeley than somebody else who's like, oh, I really think it's great to be here, best public university in the universe. The meaning, the objective environment is the same, but the meaning of the environment is very, very different. Okay, so what we want to focus on in this course is how people give meaning, interpret their environments, perceive their environments, and the consequences of those cognitive transformations of the environment for their actual behavior, because that's the case. It's your mental representation of the environment, not the objective environment, not the environment as it would be objectively described by a third-person observer, that determines your behavior in that environment. This is a point that was recognized long ago in sociology in something that has come to be known as the Thomas theorem, okay? Where Thomas and Thomas, the husband and wife team of sociologists, argued that prior to any particular act of behavior, there's always a stage of examination and deliberation, which we call the definition of the situation. And then Thomas and Thomas went on to point out that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. This is the essence of the cognitive perspective on social situation, on social interaction, which is that the way people define the situation in which their behavior takes place is going to be real, makes that definition real, because it's that definition that's going to determine how they're going to behave in it. Robert K. Merton, the great American historian of science, has characterized this as the single most consequential sentence ever put in print by any American sociologist, and it probably is. It's very, very, very profound in their implications. Merton himself was very interested in the consequences of the definition of the situation for behavior, and how the subjective definition of the situation could actually alter the objective situation itself by virtue of a process which Merton called the self-fulfilling prophecy, which he defined very concisely as a situation where, in the beginning, a false definition of the situation, okay, evokes a behavior which makes the originally false definition of the situation come true. That false definition is a cognition. It resides in the head of the actor, and it's that definition, whether it's true or false, that leads the actor to behave in particular ways. And Merton simply pointed out that the actor's behavior is actually going to bring the objective situation in line with the subjective situation. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples of this kind of thing in social psychology. We now have a very large literature in social psychology, cognitive social psychology, on what are known as expectancy confirmation effects, which come in basically 3 forms. We're going to talk about 2 of these mostly today. First, behavioral confirmation effects. Here, one person has a belief or an expectancy which leads him or her to elicit behavior from another person, which will confirm the first person's belief or expectancy. These are known as behavioral confirmation effects, because what happens is they elicit actual behavior from other people that confirms expectancies. A fairly good example of this is the famous Pygmalion in a classroom experiment by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson, where children whose teachers believed that they were smart actually performed better in the classroom than children whose teachers did not believe they were smart. And this whole set of behaviors is elicited by virtue of the fact that the teachers' beliefs led the teachers to behave in such a way towards the children as to either elicit or fail to elicit intelligent behavior from the kids. That's a very good example of behavioral confirmation effects, and I'll give you another good example in a minute. But there are also what Ned Jones, E.E. Jones, social psychologist at Princeton, referred to as perceptual confirmation effects. Here, there's kind of a double cognitive whammy, because at the same time as your beliefs are leading you to behave in such a way as to objectively confirm these beliefs, most of the behavior that we observe in the world, as I pointed out in the very first lecture, is actually pretty ambiguous. Okay, it's not self-evident what the meaning of most pieces of behavior is. So that what we'll do is we'll take an ambiguous behavior or an ambiguous event and we'll interpret it in terms of our beliefs. Okay, so even if Rosenthal and Jacobson's kids hadn't actually behaved as if they were smart, which in fact they did, the teachers might likely say, well, he's pretty smart, he's just not willing to show it, or he really needs the right kind of stimulation. The interpretation of the behavior is going to be shaped by people's expectations. The third kind of expectancy confirmation effect is known as self-verification. Again, remember, we're talking about, in the simplest case, a dyadic interaction between two individuals, one arbitrarily designated the actor, the other arbitrarily designated as the target. Behavioral confirmation and perceptual confirmation refer to what the actor does to the target. The actor, having a set of beliefs or expectations, will behave with respect to the target so as to elicit from the target behavior that confirms the actor's expectations. That's what behavioral confirmation is. Or, in the case of perceptual confirmation, whatever the target's behavior is will be interpreted by the actor as consistent with his or her beliefs and expectations. The implication so far is that actors are kind of targets are kind of passive victims of the actor's expectations. That's not necessarily true either. There's a third process, which has come to be known as self-verification, which turns the tables on the actors. Targets who know what's going on, or targets who have a particular way they want to present themselves, can act with respect to the actor so as to change the actor's beliefs and expectations and percepts. So targets are not passive victims in this process. They don't play a passive role in the general social interaction cycle. As I pointed out last time, actors are also targets of other people's actions. Let's look at how this works out in a couple of experiments. This is an experiment by Mark Snyder and Bill Swan. Swan was Snyder's graduate student at the University of Minnesota at this time. It's an old experiment, but it is a goodie. Okay, I have in my head what I call my Faustian list of experiments that I would sell my soul to have done myself. And this is one of them. This experiment is a real thing of beauty, right? You can do just one of these experiments in your entire career. You will have made your studies worthwhile. These guys did a dozen of these. It's just amazing. But this is, I think, in some respects, the cutest. It's known as the noise gun experiment. And what happens? I think I dropped a slide. I did drop a slide. Damn. Okay, here's what happens. Two subjects are brought together for an experiment, and they're told that this is an experiment on reaction time. And if any of you have been in an experiment on reaction time, you know these are the most boring experiments on God's green earth, right? You're seated in front of a computer console, and a blip comes on, and you're supposed to press a button. Another blip comes on, you're supposed to press a button, or something like that, no matter what it is. It's pretty boring. And they said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of make this a little bit more interesting. There are going to two of you in this experiment at the same time. You're going to take turns at the reaction time apparatus, and the one with the fastest reaction, just to keep your motivation up, the one with the fastest reaction time is going to get a prize. Okay, a couple of bucks extra. 1978, this was before serious inflation, a couple of bucks was serious money. So that's the prize. They said, well, just to make it even more interesting, what's going to happen is, while one of you is seated at the reaction time apparatus, the other one is going to be seated at at this button here, which we're going to call the noise gun. And he's going to be able to send a burst of white noise into your cubicle while you're at the reaction time apparatus. And we know that white noise has the effect of disrupting people's reaction times. Okay, so there's a prize for the guy with the fastest reaction time. And one of the subjects is doing his reaction time experiment. The other one is blasting him with white noise in order to disrupt his performance. You can see where this is going, right? Okay, so what happens is one of these subjects is arbitrarily chosen to sit at the to sit first at the reaction time apparatus. The other subject is left by default to sit at the noise gun. And after everybody gets seated, the experimenter goes over to the guy at the noise gun and says, I just want you to know, the guy in there, he's a really hostile person. We did some personality testing on him earlier, and he's a pretty hostile, aggressive guy. That's one condition of the experiment. The other condition of the experiment, the experimenter goes over to the guy at the noise gun and says, gee, we did some personality testing on you guys earlier, and I just want you to know this guy's a very friendly, cooperative person. Okay? So the guy seated at the noise gun thinks that the guy seated at the reaction time apparatus is either hostile and aggressive in one condition or friendly and cooperative in the other condition. Then the experiment starts. Okay? And what happens is that again, I'm really sorry about this. This is the slide that I somehow dropped. But what happens is that the labeling perceiver, the guy who has the label for the target, okay, gets to select a level of white noise that he's going to shoot into the cubicle of the target. And labeling perceivers who anticipate dealing with a hostile, aggressive person actually fire a louder noise at him than do labeling perceivers that anticipate interacting with a friendly, cooperative person. So you think you're dealing with somebody who's hostile and aggressive, and you are hostile and aggressive towards him. Okay? Now, of course, the target doesn't know anything about this. Right? He's just a guy he's just a crummy sophomore who signed up for an experiment for his introductory psychology class. He doesn't have any idea how he's been labeled. Okay? But what happens is, at the end of the trials, there are 24 trials, right? There are 24 blasts of the noise gun. The labeling perceiver who thinks that the target is friendly and hostile has been sending in these high-intensity blasts of white noise at this person. At the end of 24 trials, the subjects change places. The target who was at the noise gun, who was at the reaction time apparatus, now gets to sit at the noise gun, and the guy who sat at the noise gun now has to sit in the reaction time apparatus. And what happens? What happens is, the behavior of the target, when he's got the noise gun in his hands, is determined by how he was treated by the labeling perceiver. So targets who were labeled as hostile and aggressive now behave more hostily and aggressively than the targets who were labeled as friendly and cooperative. So